Reboots have a pretty rocky history in the gaming industry. For every good reboot like Crystal Dynamics' Tomb Raider games, you get several Bomberman Act Zeros. So it's no surprise to know that reboots are often seen with some skepticism not only on its quality as a game, but its reason for existing. When so many reboots are tone-deaf attempts to squeeze blood out of a stone, it's easy to see all of them that way. But some reboots do try to do something interesting, build on what came before it while still trying to reach new heights. That's kind of the feeling I got from Prince of Persia. It's definitely a reboot, but it feels like the people behind it were at least trying to do something different, take the series in a new direction, while still respecting what came before it. The Two Thrones left the series in a pretty weird place. On one hand, the gameplay had never been better and showed lots of ways that it could be elevated even higher if it were expanded on more, especially if brought to the next console generation. On the other hand, it ended the story started in 2003 really well, and didn't leave too many ways to naturally continue on with the established gameplay and narrative. They kind of had to do a reboot in order to keep this franchise going at all, so they did. This new game would have a lot of the same ideas as the previous games, being acrobatic platforming, puzzles, and combat, but a lot of the details would change. For instance, there would be no time powers, as this prince is not the same prince as the one from the original Sands of Time trilogy. The trailers honestly did look pretty interesting. It showed the prince with a completely new design and a new companion doing a lot of the same Prince of Persia stuff, but there was one thing that really stood out. This new game had a completely new visual style. Out was the older, more realistic looking prince, and in was this new style, which was colorful and vibrant using a cel-shaded style. I thought it looked pretty good, but that's basically where it stopped for me for the most part. Now, going into this review, I decided to take my time. I didn't go directly into playing it after Two Thrones because I feel like that game's mechanics would color my perception of this one. It really is its own thing, very different from the previous games, and I guess I just wasn't ready for that back in 2008. But now I'm ready to give it a full shot. I've heard lots of good things about it too, that it's basically underrated and really just a hidden gem. So let's get right into it. Hey people, it's ScionVyse, and let's take a look at Prince of Persia. It's kind of weird just saying that since the last three games all had subtitles. The game begins with the prince wandering through a sandstorm in a desert searching for Farah. Not the Farah we all know and love from the previous games, this Farah is the prince's donkey. I'm also pretty sure that the prince isn't a prince, but I guess some random guy from some place kinda like Persia isn't as catchy of a title, so we'll keep calling him the prince for now. The prince takes a tumble, and just as he starts his search again, a woman falls from the sky and lands right on top of him, and it's quickly revealed that she's being chased by some soldiers. The prince follows her, and after some tutorials, the soldiers try to kill the prince by dropping a boulder on him. The bridge he's crossing collapses when this woman, Elika, uses her convenient magic powers to save him from certain doom, and the two of them make their way to the temple that she's trying to reach. Once inside the temple, they're confronted by Elika's father, the king of this land. So yeah, Elika is the royalty in this game, but I guess Princess of Persia would give away a bit too much from the opening. Elika is what's known as an Ura, and they're using the powers of the god of light, or Maz, to hold the dark power of the god Ahriman at bay. I'm not going to pretend I knew about this beforehand, but rather than the original trilogy's unique mythology, the world and mythos of this game is heavily based on Zoroastrianism. I'm also not going to pretend I knew anything about this religion before starting this video, but it's an ancient one of the oldest in the world in fact, and it originates from ancient Iran, also known as Persia. Ura, Ormazd, and Ahriman are all ideas stemming from Zoroastrianism, and I already really like this. The real world is just filled to the brim with interesting ideas, mythologies, and stories, so it's really cool when a game pulls from one of those to build its own world. Now, this is more window dressing here than anything far more substantial as a way to tie the game to the real world Persia, as well as establish a simple light, good, dark, bad narrative. There's no deep dive into the philosophies of Zoroastrianism here, but I think its inclusion works well and I like it regardless. Anyways, after a battle with Elika's father, he cuts down the small tree in the center of the temple and basically, the end of the world starts to happen. Armin begins to escape, so Elika and the prince need to get out of there, and fast. They do, and Elika explains what needs to happen next. She states that the fertile grounds that keep Armin imprisoned have been corrupted, and in order to stop him from fully escaping, someone will have to go to all of the fertile grounds and heal them. That someone is obviously the prince and Elika, and much to his dismay, he agrees to help heal each of the fertile grounds. The first thing you end up having to do is pick one of the 4 initial destinations, and then travel there to find the spot that heals the fertile grounds. Before we get into the gameplay, let's talk about the thing that should stand out right away. Prince of Persia looks incredible. The cell shading that it uses along with its color palette makes every area stand out, whether corrupted or healed. It's really a testament to how much a good art style and strong art direction can do for a game. Even navigating the menus is a visual treat, even if they take a bit longer to transition than I'd like. I'd say that this game still looks better than many games that were released even 5 or more years after it due to this. It's got a strong Wind Waker effect. I did record the majority of my footage on PC, however, which allows the game to run at much higher resolutions and frame rates than the original console versions could. So while the art direction was still strong there, the performance and image clarity wasn't nearly as crisp with the original release. This strong direction continues on into the characters and their performances as well. Elika and the prince are really well designed and fit the world perfectly. Elika is voiced by Carrie Walgren, who you will probably remember from everything ever released, and she does a really good job of being the straight actor to the prince's aloof sarcasm. She keeps the story focused, but isn't a complete stick in the mud. She's basically the real protagonist, and the prince is just along for the ride. Speaking of the prince, he's voiced by Nolan North in this game. I think it works, honestly. Since this prince isn't actually a prince, he's got a much more relaxed, go-with-the-flow attitude, and that fits as a foil to Elika's seriousness and lets the two characters bounce off each other really well. Similarly to Sands of Time, the main driving force of this game's narrative is the relationship between the prince and Elika. The plot itself is pretty straightforward, and we'll get into that a bit later, but how the two protagonists talk, interact, and grow to like each other is one of the best aspects of this game. Arguably even better than the previous game, since the two are together the entire journey, so they both have much more time to grow. It's also something that you can experience whenever you want. At any point in the journey, you can have the prince and Elika have a conversation. It's really great to see how they get to know each other more throughout the game, and I really recommend having them talk frequently. If you ignore this, you ignore a lot of their characterization and relationship. The audio is a real treat. The sound design is fantastic. Everything from Elika's magic to the prince's claw scratching along the walls to the enemy's grunts are really well recorded, designed, and mixed. I'm a big fan of Armin's voice too. It's got the general big booming sound that you'd expect out of a god, but the actual voice changes every line.
I am the darkness. I am your end. You shall watch the ending of the light.
Inon Zur and Stuart Chatwood return yet again to compose the soundtrack, with Zur clearly taking the reins this time around. This soundtrack is very orchestral, very much a score instead of songs, and with that comes a lot of similar melodies and leitmotifs, which leads to music that always fits and is never bad, but has a hard time getting any one track to stand out. Just playing through the game, you wouldn't expect the OST to be a massive 3 hours long, but it is. Because of this, it was really hard to pick out any individual tracks to consider a favorite, since the music works much more as a cohesive whole rather than individual songs. That being said, I did really like the main theme. The evil is free. And escape the royal palace. Okay, so I guess it's about time to finally bring up the elephant in the room. If you've watched any of my other videos, you'll probably have noticed that this isn't exactly how I normally structure my content, and that is for a reason. As I speak, this is my second attempt to record this whole thing after 3 script rewrites. I'm having so much trouble making this one because the more I work and the more I think about this game, the more I realize that my normal format isn't going to work. I knew this day would come. I try to see the good in every game I play, and I genuinely try to get enjoyment out of every game I cover for this channel. But I knew there would come a day when it would be my turn to take a big old dump on a game that everybody enjoys, and that I wanted to have fun with myself as well. But as much as I will absolutely go to bat for this game's world, its style, its characters, the more I think about it, as a game, I think I kinda hate it. Let's go piece by piece to explain this. If it was just one aspect, I probably wouldn't have such a negative reaction to it. But as soon as it hits the mechanical or design ideas, this game just falls apart. Oh, and to be perfectly clear, if you disagree with my thoughts on this, which you probably will, that's totally fine. If you adore this game through and through, I'm happy for you and have no intention to take that away from you. I just have to face the fact that I dislike basically everything this game does from a gameplay perspective. First, let's go over the game's structure and pacing. Prince of Persia is set up in a semi-open world where the skeleton of the world is basically accessible at all times, but the meat of each area is locked off behind certain abilities. When the game starts, you have 4 places you can go, and they're all very basic. They're tutorial areas, letting you get used to the new mechanics and introducing the game's 4 main bosses. Once you clear an area and heal the fertile ground, these things pop up, and this is a huge sticking point for me right off the bat. These light seeds are spread around every area after you heal the grounds, and this is the second main part of the game. In order to reach any of the areas past the beginning 4, you are required to collect these. Elika has 4 special abilities that are locked behind their collection, and in order to progress through the entire game, you're gonna have to get all of those. The first upgrade is pretty easy to get to, needing only 60, but these requirements increase exponentially as the game goes on. There are a total of 1,000 to find, and in order to beat the game, you're going to need to collect at least 540. I hate this. These are not meaningful collectibles that are purposely and thoughtfully spread around these levels, encouraging exploration. They're just strewn around each area as a way to pad out the playtime. It kills the game's pacing and just forces you to go back through areas you've already played just to collect enough MacGuffins to have the game let you continue on. I really don't understand why these exist outside of padding. From what I can see, the only reason you don't just get a new power unlocked every 4 healings or so is because the game would only be 2 hours long without all these strewn around to extend the playtime. The worst part about it is that almost half of these light seeds are completely useless. Yeah, you have to collect 540, but after that point, there is no reason to touch another seed for the rest of the game. If you do collect all of them, you will unlock a skin for Elika and an achievement, but that's it. No hidden areas, no unique endgame power, no secret ending, nothing. The light seeds don't even respect your time enough to have a meaningful reward for the people dedicated enough to get them. And on top of that, the structure of the game itself is just very repetitive. For the most part, you can do areas in any order, so the challenge of the level design itself is basically flat the entire game. Individual areas do have some unique aspects. There are a few puzzles, there are a few areas with some unique mechanics, but aside from those puzzle areas, nothing about any of these places feels truly unique at all. Okay, that's not strictly true. There are a few that try to do something different. In one area, the prince gets corrupted and you need to rush to the fertile ground to ensure that the prince doesn't die. Of course, this is all just an illusion. There's no actual gameplay difference here at all. I stood around for over 10 minutes to see if anything would happen if you didn't rush. Nothing. You also get unique areas for final fights with each of the 4 of Ahriman's corrupted. You fight them in every area per branch, but the final is when you take them down for good. This involves beating them 2 or 3 times instead of just once. Wow, but how do you beat these bosses? With samey combat, of course. This game takes a one-on-one style of fighting apparently inspired by the original Prince of Persia, a series of duels rather than the previous trilogy's more beat-em-up style. The idea is nice, but the devil is in the details here. Or I guess Ahriman's in the details? Okay, from a programming point of view, it's fine. It isn't broken, it's not like it doesn't work, but the whole idea is fundamentally borked in my opinion. The prince has 5 things he can really do in combat. He can swing his sword, have Elika do an attack, grab an opponent, do acrobatic stuff, including a fairly useless version of the former prince's vault, and finally, he can block or parry incoming attacks. By using these different attacks in different orders, you can get some pretty flashy combos, but at the end of the day, the only difference between a flashy combo and a straightforward one is a bit of damage, and that often doesn't even matter. For all regular enemies and some of the bosses, if you knock them into a wall or start a combo near a ledge, they just die no matter what you actually did, so comboing is pointless. And for any enemy that can't be instantly killed like that, you still have parrying. Parrying breaks the entire system. I think the idea was to try to get hits and start combos from that, and block if the enemy gets the upper hand that way, like an actual sword duel. But there's no reason to take the initiative. Enemies will attack you and their attacks are all basically the same, so they're very easy to parry. Once you do, they're open for basically anything. Now, sword attacks can be blocked and grabs may not work on every enemy right away, so start with Elika and then throw, and you've solved all your problems. Just wait for them to attack, parry, do a combo, rinse and repeat until they're dead. Most of the bosses work the exact same way too. They each have their gimmicks. For instance, the hunter spits black goop at you to hinder your sight, and the concubine can reverse movement controls, but you never have to move, and once you know the timing for parrying, you don't really need to see what enemies are doing either, so these gimmicks fall flat too. It really makes for a combat system that is more tedious than it is interesting. Even the combos get boring to watch after a while, making me just want to insta-kill enemies more and more. There are a few wrinkles added in later on in the game in a transparent attempt to bandage this into something fun. Enemies will get auras that protect them from most attacks, but what it actually does is just limit player creativity. By the end of the game, enemies will always have one up, so instead of being able to start a combo with whatever attack you want, the game will force you to start a combo the way it wants you to. This is actually pretty easy to fix too. Take the aura system and make one attack type that can't damage the enemy and have it change after every hit. That would keep the player on their toes and make them use new combos, since there'd be no guarantee that their bread and butter combos will work. The final nail in the combat's coffin though is that it's impossible to lose. If for some reason you take enough damage to die, a QuickTime event pops up. If you press the right button in a 1-second window or so, you just get back up and the fight continues. If not, Elika saves you, and all that happens is the enemy gains some of their HP back. So there's no reason to even try to get the most out of this system, since you can just brute force your way through it and aren't punished in any meaningful way for not trying. And in fact, if you do things right, you can defeat enemies before they even spawn, bypassing the entire system with basically no effort. So yeah, it's not great in my opinion. On the topic of Elika, her magic saving the prince from certain death is a feature that continues on into the platforming. Platforming that, even on its own, without the guaranteed safety net at all times, just isn't very engaging. Just like in combat, you can't die at all no matter the situation. If the prince is going to meet his end, Elika will save him and drop him off at the nearest safe spot. Even if Elika is incapacitated or not around, she'll still appear out of nowhere to help you out. In one of the fights with the concubine, she captures Elika, and you have to jump off a building so Elika will save you and continue the fight. Like, if Elika can just magic herself back into the action, Why doesn't she just do that? The mechanic is kind of like if in previous games the prince had infinite rewinds that automatically happened whenever he made a mistake. This sort of thing works in games like Celeste or Super Meat Boy since they're segmented games filled with smaller, more difficult challenges. But in a more adventure-focused game like this, it just feels like the developers don't trust the player to be able to achieve even the most basic of feats. I'm not expecting crazy difficulty or anything, the previous games weren't exactly that taxing, but the constant hand-holding this game does is just a bridge too far in my opinion. The platforming itself is, again, on a purely technical level, perfectly serviceable. It all works, the prince feels fine, and yeah, it's not completely broken, but I'm really not a fan of the core design philosophy. The platforming in this game, compared to previous games, is heavily simplified to the point where in many places it basically plays itself. Okay, I'm gonna need to explain that one. The prince's moveset isn't very different from previous games. He can still wall run, he can still slide down walls, he can still swing on bars, etc, etc. But the execution is far different. It's so heavily simplified that it almost feels like it was designed as a children's game, but reworked halfway through to be Prince of Persia. Most of what the prince does while platforming is a single button press and doesn't even require directional input at all. The wall run automatically happens after every jump near a wall, climbing using these rings or doing a ceiling climb are all just a single button press of jump or grab, swinging is just a single press of jump, and the prince will always do a second jump up a wall whenever you directly jump towards one. All of the timings for these are super lenient as well, so as long as you generally know what buttons you have to press, you can basically just mash and have everything execute perfectly. Aside from saving you from every death, Elika can also help in the platforming. When jumping, she can throw the prince further than he normally would be able to, and this is a neat idea. However, the game always tells you exactly when you need to do it, so you never have to judge your jumping distance. If the screen turns grayscale, implying you're going to die while platforming, just press the Elika button and you're safe. All of this wouldn't even be that bad if it weren't for the level design. Almost every area uses the same set of obstacles in the exact same way, with the only things changing being Elika's power plates, and every level is designed so simply that everything you need to do is signposted at every turn. Because of this, you never have to think about anything you're doing, and just play Simon Says with the levels, pressing the right color when the game asks you to. This makes platforming and movement very fluid and smooth, basically effortless even. That's not as good as you'd think though, for one main reason. I would consider moving Mario in Super Mario Odyssey pretty effortless. When you make an input, Mario will follow pretty much exactly as you want him to. The game is designed to follow your commands perfectly. Prince of Persia is the opposite. It's effortless in the sense that the game has all these cool things it has planned for the prince to do, it's just waiting for the basic inputs to execute it for us. So rather than feeling like you're doing really cool stuff with a diverse and interesting moveset, it feels a lot closer to moving on to the next dialogue box in an RPG. Yeah, your input is what moved the story along, but you had very little to do with what actually occurred in that dialogue. This simplification is amplified to a pretty comical level with Elika's powers. When you encounter a plate that you can activate, you can use one of her 4 powers, the Wings, Breath, Hand, and Steps of Ormazd. There's the 4 of them, but there's really only 3, and 2 of those remaining 3 are pretty similar. Hand and Steps of Ormazd are exactly the same except with different visuals. They both simply launch you directly to another plate, a wall, or a platform. The Wings and Breath are a bit different, however. Breath lets the prince run along walls and set paths that lead either to another plate or to a ledge. Wings lets Elika fly, which creates on-rails flying sections. You can actually do something during these 2 abilities. You can move left and right while running, and move in all 4 directions while flying. That being said, most of the time you're just doing nothing, and by the end of the game, when you have to use many of these plates in a row, The actions per minute can drop into the single digits. It's nuts. You don't even have to look at the screen to play the game during most of these parts. So this is actually one of the more late game sections here that we're going to be playing through in a second here. Oh, and just to let you all know, I don't have like my digital viewfinder up at all, so I can't actually see what I'm doing. I'm looking this way. Only you can, so let's play. So far, so good. Ooh, got it too. So far, so good. Just to have that controller there. I don't know if that's blocking the shot or anything. Again, I can't see. There we go. Played the game. I hope you're starting to see what some of my problems are. I can like easy games, I can like simple games, I can even like games where you can't die. Kirby's Epic Yarn, for instance, handles failure in a very similar way to this game mechanically, but it works way better since even though you can't die, it still rewards you for playing well, and the game being easy isn't a problem either since it's still so fun and involved. There are some attempts to increase the difficulty and make things a bit more interesting. As you progress through the branches, each boss will cause a specific hazard to appear during the platforming sections. These range from moving balls of corruption and tentacles that appear from walls to corrupted bugs and gas that can kill you if you stay in it too long. The only one that actually adds anything are the moving corruption balls though. The others are either designed to not harm you if you do one thing right, or take so long to actually cause harm that they're basically not even worth talking about. And of course, since Elika will save you from any death and bring you right back to the closest stable ground, even if these obstacles did anything, it's no different than forgetting to press jump at the end of a wall run. They don't amount to anything meaningful. I guess what I'm ultimately trying to say is that the game doesn't do anything that I find rewarding or engaging to actually play. The things that I value in these sorts of games, like experimentation, memorization, planning, and executing on those plans, all these things that previous games had to some degree at the very least, are just completely gone here. And if you're not looking to be tested at all, which is fair enough, that's all fine. But for me, in terms of what you actually play, I need a lot more than what this game actually gives. Let's change directions here and talk about the story, which I genuinely think is pretty good. Like I said earlier, the plot is pretty light, but there's a lot of cool details about the characters and their relationships that make things a lot more interesting. So anyways, like usual, there's going to be a timestamp somewhere in the video that you can skip to if you want to skip it. So anyways, let's go. So as the prince and Elika are going through the fertile grounds, they encounter 4 of Ahriman's generals. These are all people from long past that offered their souls to Ahriman in exchange for what amounts to immortality and a special unique ability. The hunter was turned into a beast which let him hunt his ultimate prey, man. The concubine was given the power of illusion to make people see or believe whatever she wanted them to. The alchemist was given immortality to let him continue his macabre experiments forever. And finally, the warrior was granted invincibility so that none could stand against him. The hunter is kinda bland, but the other 3 all have pretty interesting backstories and personalities. The concubine is delusional and sees herself as a queen, and the alchemist just wants to continue his experiments with corruption, and Ahriman being alive is what facilitates that. The warrior in particular is really interesting, as through interactions with him, it's implied that he didn't give his soul to Ahriman out of any selfish desire, but as a way to protect his people for whom he was king, and that 1,000 years after the fact and seeing the suffering Ahriman is causing, the warrior is regretting his decision. He even attempts to save Elika and the prince from the explosion caused when Ahriman's corrupted are defeated. As they return to the temple to get more abilities, Elika and the prince will encounter Elika's father a few times, who is slowly growing more corrupted as time goes on. At first he attempts to get Elika to join him, but eventually the corruption is strong enough that he just attempts to kill the prince and even attacks Elika. But eventually it's time to head back into the temple and stop Ahriman for good. Once all the fertile grounds are healed, the two of them head back to face Ahriman. This boss is so cool. It's played entirely through the point of view of Ahriman as Elika and the prince work their way to different grounds to seal him away. So you'll be dodging Ahriman's punches and avoiding his waves of corruption as you work your way around the temple. It's also largely in black and white, with only a few things turning color as they're healed. Man, this boss deserved a better game. After the final bit is healed, the prince and Elika use plates and jump straight into Ahriman, where Elika is able to use her power to reseal him. Not fully, however, so she takes the final step to ensure that Ahriman will never be seen again. She gives her life to power the seal, and dies. At this point, you can basically call this an ending. The prince picks Elika up and takes her to the front of the temple where he lays her to rest. But the game isn't actually done, there's still one thing left to do. The prince has never really been one to look at the big picture. He does what he thinks is right at the time and deals with the consequences later, so it shouldn't be much of a surprise to know what he does next. Rather than leave this land, find Farah, and go home, he decides to save Elika. He goes around the temple grounds chopping down all the trees that sealed Ahriman away, before finally heading back to the temple to get the final light seed and revive Elika. Of course, this basically dooms the world, and Elika isn't exactly too happy about the whole situation, but that's tomorrow's problem. And the game ends with the prince and Elika walking away from the crumbling ruins of the temple as Ahriman makes his final escape. So that was Prince of Persia. I honestly don't know what to say anymore. Outside of the story, visuals, and sound, I really did not enjoy my time with this game at all. The mechanics were all super bland and had no depth at all. The combat was all largely the same, and the game's structure, with its reliance on really poorly implemented collectathon MacGuffins, made for an experience that I had a very hard time getting through. There is a console exclusive epilogue, and yeah, I bought and played that too. It introduces a new mechanic which would have been great in a game that actually lets you play, and covers Elika and the prince as they escape Ahriman. It basically ends the same way as the base game, so unless you're dying for more, I really don't think it's worth it. In terms of extras, there are a few things, including concept art and some skins that you unlock from various codes, which were supposed to be pre-order exclusive, but leaked onto the internet as these things do. They're pretty cool. You get skins for the previous prince and Farah, as well as Altair from Assassin's Creed and Jade from Beyond Good and Evil. And if you wanted to know, collecting all of the light seeds gives Elika and the prince their prototype skins. Cool enough, but definitely not worth the trouble. Man, I wish I could have liked this game. At a glance, it should be a game I really enjoy, but there are just so many things that I just hated. And unfortunately, the things I took issue with the most are the most important parts of a game, the gameplay. But I guess this one just wasn't for me, which is fine. I can't like everything. But yeah, I guess that's basically it. For all of you who like this game, sorry. I really did want to like it, but it just wasn't meant to be. I guess I'll be moving on to Forgotten Sands next, and from what I've heard, that game didn't even have the staunch defenders that this one does, so oh boy. I guess I'll see you all later. While researching, I have learned that Forgotten Sands is actually 4 games, so I'll have to figure out how to handle that. So look forward to either 4 videos or a Forgotten Sands Megamix video, probably.